Have you ever been looked right through, as if you were invisible, as if your very presence was a mistake that needed to be corrected? The air inside the first-class cabin of Apex Air Flight 932 was thick with the quiet hum of money and privilege. And in that bubble, a man named Jamal Harris was being erased. He stood in the aisle, his boarding pass in his hand, the ink clear and precise, seat 1A. But his seat was taken. The man in it, Spencer Hill, didn't even bother to look up from his phone. He just waved a dismissive hand, a gesture you might use on a fly. Find another seat, buddy. This one's taken. The condescension was a physical blow, sharp and deliberate. The flight attendant hovered nearby, her smile frozen, her eyes darting between Spencer's tailored suit and Jamal's simple jacket. In that split-second calculation, she made her choice. "Sir," she said to Jamal, her voice dripping with fake corporate sympathy, "perhaps we can find you another comfortable seat." There might have been a system glitch. A glitch. Imagine that. Your dignity, your right to be there, dismissed as a computer error. The other passengers, a silent jury of the elite, pretended to read their papers, but their eyes flickered over the scene. Their silence was a verdict, a quiet vote cast in favor of the man in the expensive suit. Spencer, annoyed that Jamal hadn't simply vanished, finally looked up. His eyes raked over Jamal's plain jacket, a flicker of disgust on his face. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Move." The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp, an order backed by a lifetime of unearned authority. But then, the expected scene shattered. Jamal didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, and he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a cold, razor-thin line that didn't reach his eyes. In his eyes, there was a dangerous stillness that made the air in the cabin crackle. The quiet was more terrifying than any outburst. If this happened to you, would you stay quiet or speak up? Jamal's silence became a weapon. It was a suffocating pressure that unnerved everyone who was watching. The flight attendant fidgeted, her training useless against this calm defiance. Spencer's smirk began to feel a little too tight on his face. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was a hidden game where the rules weren't clear. The first-class cabin, with its polished leather and champagne glasses, had transformed into a courtroom, and every glance from the other passengers added to the weight of judgment. They saw a black man in a simple jacket and assumed he was in the wrong place. How easily a person's worth can be decided by the label society puts on them. How quickly a uniform or an expensive suit can be mistaken for power. Spencer, convinced he had won this silent battle of wills, finally let out a small, arrogant huff. He turned back to his phone, a king reclaiming his throne, dismissing Jamal as nothing more than a momentary inconvenience he had successfully swatted away. The flight attendant cleared her throat, about to deliver the final blow, and asked Jamal to move to another part of the plane, to accept his place. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, Jamal's hand moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached inside his jacket. His face was unreadable, a mask of pure, cold composure. Spencer Hill and everyone else in that cabin thought the confrontation was over. They couldn't have been more wrong. It had just begun, and the thing Jamal was about to pull out wasn't just a phone. It was a trigger. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe, because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. The trigger was pulled, but there was no sound. Only silence. A deep, heavy silence that radiated from Jamal Harris like a cold front, consuming the entire first-class cabin and chilling the manufactured warmth. But there was nothing. No anger, no humiliation, no flicker of fear. His expression was a blank wall, and you have to wonder, how much practice does it take to build a wall that high? How many years of microaggressions, of being underestimated, of swallowing your rage, does it take to perfect a composure so absolute it becomes a weapon? Behind that wall, a war was being planned, and his stillness was a declaration. You could feel the tension become a physical thing, a change in pressure in the cabin that made your ears pop and the air feel thin. It was no longer just an awkward moment. It was a standoff. The flight attendant was visibly panicking now, her professionally trained smile completely gone, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. She kept wringing her hands, twisting a small napkin into a shredded mess. Her mind was racing, weighing the unwritten rules. Upset the man in the $1,000 suit who screamed VIP, or deal with the quiet, unidentifiable man who refused to bend? Corporate policy was one thing. The raw, unspoken hierarchy of wealth and race was another. She made the calculation everyone in her position makes. She sided with the power she could see. The whispers started among the other passengers, quiet hisses of judgment and irritation. A woman across the aisle, adorned with pearls and a look of profound disapproval, pointedly turned to stare out the window. A businessman too rose back, sighed loudly, shaking his head as if Jamal's very presence was a personal inconvenience. "What is he waiting for?" one whispered. "Why doesn't he just move?" They didn't see a man demonstrating immense control. They saw a problem, an obstacle delaying their pre-flight champagne. Their minor comfort was infinitely more important than his fundamental dignity. This quiet, immovable rebellion was too much for Spencer Hill to bear. Men like Spencer are predators who feed on reaction. They need your anger, your fear, your submission to validate their own fragile sense of superiority. Jamal's composure was starving him, and he was getting desperate. This quiet black man was defying the natural order of things, and Spencer's entire world was built on that order. He leaned forward, his voice a low snarl, dripping with a lifetime of unearned privilege. "Hey, I said move." He paused, letting the silence stretch, before adding the final, ugly twist of a knife, the words he chose specifically to maim. "Are you deaf, or just slow?" That word, slow, it didn't just hang in the air. It landed with a sickening thud in the pristine quiet of the cabin. It was deliberately cruel, a verbal acid thrown with the intent to scar. It was designed to strip away the last shreds of a man's intelligence and humanity in front of a dozen silent witnesses. Have you ever had a word thrown at you that was meant to break you? To make you feel small, worthless, less than human? You could feel the audience of passengers flinch. A line had been crossed. It was ugly, and they knew it. But still, nobody spoke. Nobody met Jamal's eyes. They retreated further behind their newspapers and their privilege, their silence a deafening roar of complicity. But here's the thing about power, the kind that endures. It's rarely about the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, silence speaks with more authority than any confrontation. Sometimes, silence is strategy. Jamal didn't even blink. He gave no indication that he had heard Spencer's insult at all. Instead, he brought up his phone. He wasn't filming. He wasn't calling for help. He was initiating a sequence. His thumb moved across the screen with a calm, practiced efficiency that was almost hypnotic to watch. He pressed a single contact, a name buried under a simple initial, and lifted the phone to his ear. The entire cabin, as if on cue, held its collective breath. His voice, when it came, was the exact opposite of Spencer's snarling rage. It was low, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion. Every syllable dripped with a chilling degree of absolute control. "It's Harris," he said into the phone. The flight attendant's hand, which had been reaching for the intercom button to call security, froze mid-air. Jamal continued, his eyes locked on a point somewhere in the distance, seeing a chessboard no one else in the cabin even knew existed. "Pull the plug on the Hilltech acquisition." Spencer's dismissive frown flickered with confusion. Hilltech? The name was a distant bell, a bizarre and jarring coincidence. He started to open his mouth, a nervous, mocking laugh forming on his lips, but Jamal wasn't finished. "Send a memo to the board." Jamal's voice cut through the cabin like a surgeon's blade, precise and final. "We're pulling the offer, effective immediately." He ended the call without waiting for a reply and slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket with the finality of a judge laying down a gavel. The ever-present hum of the plane's engine seemed to fade into nothing. The whispers stopped. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of papers, it all just ceased. An unnatural, vacuum-sealed stillness descended, thick and suffocating. Something massive had just happened. A bomb had detonated silently, and no one had seen the explosion yet, only the blinding flash. Spencer stared, his mind scrambling to connect the dots. Harris. Hilltech, the board. It felt like pieces of a nightmare floating just out of his grasp. He looked at Jamal's simple jacket, then at his cold, unblinking eyes, and for the first time, a sliver of ice-cold fear pierced through the thick armor of his arrogance. This man wasn't just some random guy. Who was he? What, in God's name, had he just done? Spencer Hill thought he was in a fight for a first-class seat. He was about to find out he had just lost a multi-billion-dollar war, and he still had no idea who his enemy was. The silence that followed the phone call was heavier, sharper than the one that had come before. It was the crushing silence of an execution chamber after the trapdoor has fallen and the rope has gone taut. Spencer Hill's world, once so solid and certain, a fortress built on wealth and privilege, had begun to fracture at its very foundations. His arrogant smirk, which had been plastered on his face like a birthright, finally faltered. It didn't just fade. It seemed to melt off his face, sliding away to reveal the slack, confused expression of a man who had just witnessed an impossible magic trick. His mind was a frantic, chaotic mess, a high-speed collision of denial and dawning horror. It was desperately trying to catch the words that had just flown past him like bullets. Harris. Board. Hilltech. The names echoed in the sudden, cavernous emptiness of his confidence, each one a hammer blow against the walls of his reality. Hilltech. His company. His failing, bleeding, desperate company that he was flying across the country to save. The name of his last hope and his greatest shame, spoken with such casual authority by this nobody. It was a glitch in the matrix, a tear in the fabric of his universe. It had to be a coincidence, a cruel, insane prank. Men in cheap jackets didn't talk about multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. They didn't have boards. They didn't pull plugs. Spencer's entire understanding of the social and economic order screamed that this was impossible. And yet, a cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into the marrow of his bones. The shift in the cabin was palpable. You could taste the ozone in the air. The flight attendant, her face now a pale mask of raw anxiety, muttered a barely audible, "Excuse me," and practically fled toward the galley. She wasn't walking. She was retreating, a soldier breaking ranks. She moved with the frantic urgency of someone who suddenly realized they were standing next to an unexploded bomb. In her hand, she clutched her airline-issued tablet, her fingers flying across the screen, stabbing at the glass. She was tearing through the passenger manifest, the official record, the document that would tell her if she had just made a terrible, career-ending mistake. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't just looking up a name. She was searching for a ghost, a VIP so far above the normal echelons of power that he wouldn't even be flagged, a man for whom discretion was not a preference, but a law of physics. Her panic was a blood-in-the-water signal to the rest of the cabin. The herd, which had been passively observing, now sensed a predator in their midst. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, morphing from quiet judgment into excited speculation. The pretense of ignoring the conflict was gone. Now, every passenger was staring openly, their eyes darting between the man in the tailored suit, who now looked pale and dangerously fragile, and the man in the simple jacket, who hadn't moved a muscle. The quiet hum of privilege had been replaced by the electric buzz of a brewing storm. It was a spectator sport in the Colosseum of first class. They could smell blood. They could sense a fall from grace was about to happen. And there is nothing the privileged love more than watching one of their own get torn down from a safe distance. Spencer felt their eyes on him, hot and judgmental. He could feel his power, his status, his entire identity, draining away with every second of this humiliating inaction. He had to take it back. He had to crush this man and re-establish the natural order of his world. He puffed out his chest, a desperate, reflexive motion of a threatened animal, and turned to Jamal. He tried to summon his earlier rage, his easy, dismissive condescension, but it came out wrong, twisted by the fear that was now constricting his throat. "Wait," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, a pale imitation of his usual booming confidence. "What did you just say?" "Hilltech." He tried to force a laugh, to frame it all as a joke. but the sound that escaped his lips was a strangled, pathetic bark. "You think I care who you call?" There it was, the crack in the armor, visible for all to see. That tremor in his voice that betrayed the pure terror underneath the bravado. He was no longer a king giving an order. He was a scared man pleading for answers he was terrified to hear. Have you ever seen a bully lose their power in real time? It's a pathetic sight. A hollow man suddenly realizing his throne is made of cardboard, and the tide is coming in. Jamal didn't answer his desperate questions. He didn't need to. He had already passed sentence. Having finished his business, he calmly slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. Then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he turned his head slowly and met Spencer's eyes. There are looks of anger, and there are looks of hatred. This was neither. What came from Jamal's eyes was something far colder, far more devastating. It was a look of profound finality, mixed with something that looked almost like pity. It was the calm, dissecting gaze of a surgeon looking at a cancer he is about to remove, necessary, precise, and entirely impersonal. It was a look that didn't acknowledge Spencer as an opponent or even as a person. It simply acknowledged him as a problem that had now been, and would continue to be, solved. In that single, silent stare, every ounce of Spencer Hill's superiority, every brick in the fortress of his ego, was systematically dismantled, and he was left naked and exposed in the aisle of the plane. That look broke him. A terrifying, primal urgency seized him. He fumbled for his own phone, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip the smooth metal. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temple. He couldn't get the unlock pattern right. His thumb kept slipping. What was he even looking for? He didn't know. He just scrolled frantically, his thumb swiping past a blur of mundane notifications, emails from his CFO, a dozen texts from his PR team, searching for an answer, for anything that could make the world make sense again. And then it appeared. Not as an email, not as a text, but as a breaking news notification banner that dropped down from the top of his screen like a guillotine's blade. The source was a major financial news network, its familiar red logo a sudden splash of blood against the screen. The letters were stark and black against the white background. Breaking, Apex Capital withdraws $2.8 billion Hilltech acquisition offer, citing unforeseen circumstances. Spencer read the words once, twice, 3 times. His breathing stopped. His lungs seized. The sounds of the cabin, the whispers, the hum of the engine, the clink of a distant glass, faded into a deafening roar in his ears. Apex Capital, his saviors, the global investment firm that was his last and only lifeline, the deal he had flown here to finalize. Withdraws. The words seemed to pulsate on the screen, a venomous, living thing. It was a death sentence. The man who thought he owned the sky just realized he was falling without a parachute. His world tilted on its axis, spinning violently, sickeningly out of control. He looked up from the screen, his eyes wide with a horror so pure it was almost childlike, and stared at Jamal. The man in the simple jacket. The glitch. The nobody. The ghost who had just vaporized a $2.8 billion deal with a 60-second phone call. The pieces were crashing together in his mind, forming a picture of a monster he had foolishly provoked. This man had just destroyed his life's work, his entire future, in a matter of minutes. And as he looked at the face of the man who now held his fate in his hands, a single, terrifying thought screamed through the chaos in his mind. He had absolutely no idea who he was. The silence in the cabin was no longer just tense. It was sacred. It was the held breath of a congregation waiting for a verdict from the heavens, a profound quiet that swallowed the hum of the engines. Every eye was fixed on the narrow aisle, the stage where this brutal drama was reaching its climax. Spencer Hill stood frozen, a statue of crumbling arrogance, his mind a screaming vortex of fear and denial. He was a man drowning in plain sight, 30,000 feet in the air, and the faces watching him were not filled with sympathy, but with a cold, predatory curiosity. The ghost he had tried to exorcise was still standing there, calm and immovable, a silent testament to a form of power Spencer was only just beginning to comprehend. Then, a figure emerged from the galley. It was the flight attendant. But she was a different person from the one who had fled moments before. Her corporate composure was gone, shattered into a million pieces. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that went far beyond worrying about a customer complaint. This was the primal fear of someone who had just looked up a simple name and found God on their passenger manifest. In the galley, she had seen it. Not just the name, Jamal Harris, but the passenger code next to it. A discreet, almost invisible string of characters that, to the airline's executive staff, was the equivalent of a nuclear launch code. It signified a black-level passenger, a class of travelers so rare and powerful they were spoken of in whispers. These weren't just VIPs. They were the men who owned the companies that built the planes, the men whose net worth dwarfed the airline's entire market cap. And she, in her ignorance, had just allowed one of them to be humiliated. Her walk back down the aisle was not a walk of service. It was a walk of atonement. She didn't look at Spencer. She didn't even seem to register his existence, as if he were a piece of luggage that had fallen into the aisle. Her path was a straight, unwavering line directly to Jamal Harris. Every step she took was heavy, deliberate, a drumbeat marking the end of one man's reign and the beginning of another's. She stopped a respectful distance from Jamal, her posture no longer that of an authority figure, but of a supplicant before a king. She took a shaky breath, and when she spoke, her voice trembled, stripped of all its earlier, fake sympathy. It was raw, real, and laced with pure, unadulterated fear. "Mr. Harris," she began, the name landing like a thunderclap in the silent cabin. "My deepest, most sincere apologies. There's been a terrible mistake on our part. An inexcusable, catastrophic error." She gestured with a trembling hand toward the plush leather of seat 1A. "Please, your seat is ready." Mr. Harris, the name, now spoken with such reverence, such groveling deference, hit Spencer like a physical blow. It was the same name from the phone call. The impossible was becoming terrifyingly real. The flight attendant, the very symbol of the airline's authority who had sided with him just minutes ago, was now publicly bowing to the man in the cheap jacket. Have you ever been in a situation where the world you thought you knew, the rules you thought you mastered, were flipped upside down in an instant? It's the ultimate form of vertigo, the sickening realization that you are not in control, and you never were. The passengers were connecting the dots now. The woman with the pearls, the businessman who had sighed in annoyance. Their expressions shifted from judgment to awe, and then to a new kind of fear. The wealthy are experts at recognizing power, and they had just witnessed one of the great predators of their world reveal himself. A desperate, animalistic need for proof, for certainty, clawed at Spencer's insides. This couldn't be happening. He stumbled back, fumbling to unlatch his tray table, his hands clumsy and uncoordinated. He yanked out his laptop, the expensive, razor-thin machine feeling like a clumsy block of stone in his trembling fingers. It clattered onto the table. The entire cabin watched him, their pity and morbid curiosity a suffocating blanket. He stabbed at the power button. The screen flickered to life, the familiar startup chimes sounding like a funeral dirge in the silent cabin. The in-flight Wi-Fi was slow, agonizingly slow. Each second the browser took to load was an eternity of dread. His fingers, slick with a cold sweat, slipped on the keys as he typed, misspelling the name twice before he got it right. JML, HAIS. He hit enter, and for a fraction of a second, the screen was a blank, white void. It was the last moment of his ignorance, the last moment of the world as he knew it. Then, the search results flooded the page. His eyes scanned past the first few links, a LinkedIn profile, some minor mentions in trade publications. And then he saw it. The top headline from a global financial news outlet, published just last week. The words seemed to leap off the screen and burn themselves onto his brain, branding him with his own stupidity. Jamal Harris, the silent shark CEO of Apex Capital, poised for a $2.8 billion takeover of struggling Hill Tech. Spencer stopped breathing. Every function of his body ceased. The world narrowed to that single, devastating sentence. Jamal Harris, the name of the ghost. CEO, the title of ultimate, unquestionable power. Apex Capital, Not just a company. The company. The most ruthless, most successful investment firm on the planet. A name whispered with fear and reverence in every boardroom he'd ever been in. And it was the name of the firm he had been praying would save him. He hadn't just been rude to a powerful man. He had spat in the face of his own savior. And in doing so, he had turned him into his executioner. In that moment, every ounce of privilege, every layer of arrogance, every bit of the unearned confidence that Spencer Hill had worn like a second skin his entire life, simply drained from his face, leaving behind the pale, terrified mask of a man who understood he was already dead. He wasn't just looking at a man he had disrespected. He wasn't just looking at a man who had cost him a deal. He was looking at the man who held his entire empire, his past, his present, and his now non-existent future in the palm of his hand. While Spencer was being consumed by his public revelation, Jamal finally moved. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the terrified flight attendant, a gesture of dismissal, not of thanks. He stepped forward. He didn't look at Spencer, who was now just an obstacle in the aisle, a piece of human furniture to be navigated around. He walked past him, and with a quiet sigh of expensive leather, he sat down. In his seat, seat 1A. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't say a single word. He simply reclaimed what was his. The act was a quiet coronation, a silent checkmate. It was the final, wordless declaration that the game was over. Spencer was left standing there for a horrifying second, a ghost in his own story, before he finally, mechanically, stumbled into the seat next to Jamal, the one that wasn't his. He was trapped. The cabin door was closed. The plane would be in the air for hours. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had to sit there, marinating in his public humiliation, stewing in the acidic juices of his own catastrophic mistake. The man whose life he destroyed was now sitting so close he could feel the warmth from his body, could hear the calm, steady rhythm of his breathing. And as the plane began to taxi down the runway, a new, more terrifying thought began to bloom in the wasteland of his mind. This wasn't the end of his punishment. This was just the beginning. The man next to him had destroyed his company with a phone call before the plane had even taken off. What would he do to him in this small, enclosed space by the time it landed? The plane ascended, a smooth and powerful climb into the darkening sky, a miracle of engineering defying gravity with effortless grace. But Spencer Hill was in a violent, uncontrolled descent. He was strapped into a plush leather seat that now felt like an electric chair, a prison of his own making, and his mind had become a torture chamber. The quiet hum of the engines, a sound that had always soothed him, was gone, replaced by the frantic, thundering drumbeat of his own heart. Every beat was a ticking clock, counting down the seconds to the complete and utter implosion of his life. And in the black theater of his mind, a movie was playing on an endless, horrifying loop, a film where he was both the villain and the victim. He saw his own face, twisted in a sneer of casual cruelty that now looked monstrous. He heard his own voice, dripping with a condescension that sounded like the confession of a madman. "Find another seat, buddy. This one's taken." The words echoed, each syllable a fresh stab of agonizing regret. "Are you deaf, or just slow?" The memory was so vivid, so visceral, that he flinched, a small, convulsive jerk that went unnoticed by the man sitting serenely beside him. A part of his brain, the arrogant, cornered part, tried to fight back, to build a wall of justification. It was a setup, the voice hissed. Why was he dressed like that? In first class. He wanted a reaction. He was trying to provoke me. But the excuses were flimsy, pathetic shields against the tidal wave of truth. He had done this. His prejudice, his ego, his blindness, they were the architects of this ruin. Because while Spencer was unraveling, a puppet whose strings had been cut, Jamal Harris was a portrait of impossible calm. The flight attendant, the same one who had trembled before him, now approached him with a quiet reverence that bordered on worship. She offered him a drink, a sparkling water with a slice of lime, her hand steady, her eyes cast downward, as if she were an acolyte serving a deity. Jamal accepted it with a slight, gracious nod, his composure a stark, brutal contrast to the frantic, self-destructive storm raging inside Spencer. Jamal then opened a worn paperback book, its pages filled with underlined passages and notes scribbled in the margins, and began to read, utterly at peace, completely absorbed. What was he reading? Philosophy? A classic novel? It didn't matter. The simple, mundane act of turning a page became, in that moment, an act of supreme and terrifying power. The narrator of this story would pause here and tell you that one man's peace came from a lifetime of self-mastery, of building an unshakable core in a world that tried to break him. The other man's torment came from a lifetime of unearned privilege being challenged for the very first time, and finding he had no foundation at all. The crushing realization hit Spencer not like a wave, but like a building collapsing on top of him, grinding him into dust. It wasn't just that he had been rude. It wasn't just that he had insulted a powerful man. He had insulted the only man, his last financial lifeline, his one and only savior in a world that was closing in on him. Memories, sharp and unwelcome, flashed behind his eyes like lightning strikes in a storm. He was in his boardroom, the long, polished table reflecting the worried faces of his executive team. He saw the red ink on a quarterly report, a river of failure bleeding across the page. He saw himself standing before his father's oldest friend and board member, a man named Arthur Vance. He could hear Arthur's voice, not angry, but pleading, a fatherly tone that Spencer had arrogantly dismissed. "You're running out of road, Spencer. Your father's legacy is on the line. This Apex deal is everything. Don't let your pride get in the way of this. The man you're meeting, Harris, is not like us. He's smarter, quieter. Be respectful. This is our last chance." Spencer remembered how he had smirked, how he had clapped Arthur on the shoulder and told him not to worry. He remembered the sleepless nights, the constant, grinding anxiety of steering a sinking ship, a truth he had hidden from the world behind a mask of bravado. Hilltech wasn't just in trouble. It was on life support, riddled with the cancer of his own mismanagement and reckless risks. The acquisition by Apex Capital wasn't a victory. It was a desperate, last-minute rescue mission. It was survival. And he, in a fit of pathetic, racist arrogance, had just spat in the face of the rescue pilot and set fire to the helicopter. It was all gone. And it was gone because of him. What happens when the world learns that arrogance has a price? Spencer was about to find out in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. His mind, no longer content to torment him with the past, now leaped forward to the terrifying, immediate future. He could already see the headlines flashing across the financial news networks. Hilltech CEO's public meltdown scuttles Apex deal. He could see the stock ticker, the letters HTEC next to a brutal, blood-red arrow pointing straight down, a flat line into oblivion. He could picture the faces of his board of directors on an emergency Zoom call, their initial shock curdling into incandescent fury. These were men he had known for years, men whose fortunes and reputations were tied to his. He hadn't just destroyed himself. He had vaporized their children's inheritance, their retirements, their legacies. Sweat rolled down his temple, cold and stinging. His phone, which he had placed face down on the tray table as if it were a venomous snake, began to vibrate. It was a low, insistent buzz, a sound of pure doom that seemed to vibrate through the armrest and up his spine. It buzzed once, twice, then again, and again, a relentless, tactile reminder of the world outside this cabin that was now coming for him. It was a monster on his tray table, and it was waking up. He didn't need to look. He knew who it was. Frantic messages from his CFO, a man who probably thought Spencer had been taken hostage. 100 missed calls from his PR team, a SWAT team of damage control specialists who were now facing a data bomb they could never contain. He imagined the short, frantic text messages piling up, unread but screaming at him from under the dark screen. "Call me now. What did you do? Market is reacting. Total freefall." He couldn't look. He couldn't answer. He was a coward, paralyzed by the consequences of his own actions. He was trapped in this psychological prison at 30,000 feet, forced to face the real-time cost of his prejudice, and it was a price he couldn't bear to pay. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it all out, trying to make the world disappear. But it was useless. The phone continued its death rattle on the table, a physical manifestation of his ruined life. The buzzing finally stopped. For a blissful, heart-stopping second, there was a profound silence. A brief, merciful respite from the cacophony of his failure. He took a shaky breath, the first he'd taken in what felt like an hour. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe the world had finally given up on him. Then, the phone screen lit up. There was no vibration this time. No sound. Just a bright, silent, unholy glow that illuminated his pale, sweaty hands in the dim cabin light. He couldn't help it. His eyes were drawn to it, a moth to a flame that promised only immolation. The screen wasn't showing a name. It wasn't his CFO or his frantic PR chief. It was a title that signified the genesis and the final authority of his entire world. A title that made his blood run cold and his stomach turn to ice. The chairman. It was Arthur Vance, the chairman of the board. The man his father had entrusted with the company's legacy on his deathbed. The one man Spencer answered to, not just as a CEO, but as a son. The one man he could not lie to, could not hide from, could not, under any circumstances, ignore. The screen just glowed, a silent, final summons. His hand hovered over the phone, trembling, caught between the hell of answering and the deeper, colder hell of what would happen if he didn't. Have you ever been in a room where the silence was louder than a scream? That's the world Spencer Hill now inhabited. The explosive drama of the revelation had passed, leaving behind a chilling, vacuum-sealed quiet in the first-class cabin. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a predator's cage, and Spencer was the one on the wrong side of the bars. The steady hum of the engines was no longer a comforting sound of progress. It was the low growl of a clock counting down to his own execution. His prison was plush and leather-bound, but it was a prison nonetheless. He sat bolted upright, a man whose spine had turned to rebar, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles were white stones. His expensive suit, once a suit of armor, now felt like a straitjacket, suffocating him in his own failure. He hadn't answered the chairman's call. He had simply watched the name glow on the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs, and let it go to voicemail, an act of cowardice so profound it felt like a physical stain on his soul. Now the phone sat face down on his tray table. It wasn't a device anymore. It was a tombstone, marking the death of the man he used to be. And the architect of this silent hell? He was an ocean of calm. While Spencer was being eaten alive from the inside out, Jamal Harris was a portrait of serene power. The flight attendant had approached him, not as a saver, but as a supplicant, offering him a drink with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. Jamal had accepted it with a quiet nod. He read a few pages from a worn paperback, his focus absolute. Now, he was simply resting, his head leaned back against the headrest, eyes closed. But he wasn't asleep. You could feel it. He was a lion at rest, utterly aware, radiating a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. This was the true nature of his punishment. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, elegant, and absolute. At 30,000 feet, one man was experiencing a catastrophic loss of altitude, his wings torn off, spiraling into the abyss. The other had never needed wings to begin with. Jamal never looked at Spencer again. Not once. He didn't have to. His silence, his complete and utter refusal to acknowledge the man sitting inches away from him, was the most profound judgment of all. It was an act of erasure. It told Spencer more powerfully than any words ever could. You are nothing. You are insignificant. You are a minor, unpleasant piece of turbulence on my journey, and now you are gone. You can argue with a man who shouts. You can fight a man who hits you. But what can you do with a man who simply decides you no longer exist? Time ceased to have meaning. Every second dragged, thick and heavy like tar. Every minute was an hour of quiet, suffocating torment. Spencer was trapped with the ghost of his own arrogance, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He was forced to simply sit there, marinating in the acid of his own catastrophic mistake, breathing the same recycled air as the man who now owned his future. Then, After an eternity carved from shame and dread, the spell was broken. A subtle shift in the pitch of the engines. A gentle, two-tone chime that cut through the gloom like a scalpel, followed by the captain's voice, impossibly calm and cheerful. "Folks, we've begun our initial descent into San Francisco." The words were a death knell. The end of the line. The quiet purgatory of the flight was over, and the public hell of the real world was waiting for him on the ground. He couldn't hide anymore. He had to know the full extent of the damage. He had to face the tsunami. With a slow, reluctant motion that felt like lifting a slab of concrete, he finally reached for his phone. His hand trembled, a leaf in a hurricane. His thumb, slick with cold sweat, hovered over the home button. He squeezed his eyes shut, took one last, shuddering breath of the man he used to be, and pressed down. The screen flooded the dark cabin with a brilliant, terrible light. The thud of the landing gear hitting the tarmac was a brutal, physical shock, a violent punctuation mark at the end of the longest sentence of Spencer Hill's life. The landing was rough, a series of jarring bumps and the scream of reverse thrusters that felt like reality itself clawing its way back into the insulated, timeless horror of the flight. The polite fiction was officially over. With a loud, final click, the cabin lights snapped to full, unforgiving brightness, erasing every shadow, exposing every pale, shaken face as if they were all suspects in a lineup. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed off, and that sound was a starting pistol for a digital firing squad. All around the cabin, phones began to chirp and buzz, reconnecting to the world, a digital chorus heralding the return to normalcy. But on Spencer's phone, it wasn't a chorus. It was a tsunami. The screen he had unlocked just before landing, the screen that had been a silent, glowing threat, was now a torrent of information so violent and so fast he couldn't even process it. A banner for 99+ missed calls. A notification for 200+ new messages. The icons and numbers scrolled past in a frantic, blurry cascade of panic from a world that had already tried, convicted, and sentenced him while he was helplessly suspended in the air. His trembling thumb swiped through the wall of notifications, a desperate, clumsy gesture that accidentally opened a news app. And there it was. His judgment, delivered in cold, black pixels, laid out for the entire world to see. The first headline was the financial death sentence, the clean, corporate language a thin veil for a brutal execution. Apex Capital terminates $2.8 billion Hilltech acquisition. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was real, not a nightmare, not a misunderstanding. It was a fact, now etched into the public record. The second headline was the immediate, catastrophic fallout, the mathematical proof of his failure. Hilltech stocks crashed 47% in pre-market trading. Trading halted, almost half the company's value, gone. Vaporized in a matter of hours. He thought of the employees, the pension funds, the small-time investors who had believed in him, in his father's legacy. He had just wiped them out. That number wasn't a statistic. It was a body count of livelihoods and futures. But the third headline, the third one was the one that stopped his heart. It wasn't about money or the company. It was about him, his name, his reputation, his utter and complete disgrace, forever memorialized on the internet. CEO Spencer Hill under fire for alleged racist incident aboard Flight 932. His blood ran cold. How? How could they possibly know the details? How did it get out so fast? His eyes, wide with a new, paranoid terror, darted around the cabin. He looked at the other passengers who were now gathering their bags, their faces expertly averted, pointedly refusing to meet his gaze. The woman with the pearls was tapping furiously on her phone, a small, triumphant smirk on her face. The businessman who had been annoyed by the delay was whispering to his seatmate, who shot a venomous, disgusted look in Spencer's direction. Someone had talked. Someone had filmed. One of the silent jurors in this airborne courtroom had already leaked the verdict to the press. He wasn't just ruined. He was a spectacle, a trending topic, a villain in a story that was now spreading across the globe at the speed of light. Just then, the cabin door swung open, and a wave of normal airport noise, the distant call for boarding, The rumble of rolling suitcases, the cacophony of 1,000 lives intersecting, flooded the tense silence. While Spencer sat paralyzed, entombed in his seat by his digital ruin, Jamal Harris moved. He stood up, not with a triumphant leap, but with a quiet, deliberate grace that commanded the attention of the entire cabin. He calmly adjusted the simple jacket he was wearing, the same jacket Spencer had judged as unworthy of this sacred space. He didn't look back. He didn't spare a single glance for the man he had just dismantled piece by piece. He simply walked toward the open door with the quiet, unshakable authority of a man who had already moved on to the next, more important item on his agenda. As he stepped into the jet bridge, a final text message illuminated his screen, a simple, two-word confirmation of a perfectly executed strategy. It's done. Spencer watched him disappear into the anonymity of the terminal. He watched the man he had tried to erase walk away, not just with his seat, but with his entire future. And in that moment, the last of his strength, the last of his pride, the last of his denial, finally crumbled into dust. He slumped into his seat, a hollowed-out shell of a man, pale, shattered, and utterly, irrevocably broken. The phone slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. He thought power came from the seat he stole, the suit he wore, the assumptions he made based on the color of a man's skin. But real power, the kind that can move markets and change lives with a single, quiet word, had been sitting in silence the whole time, wearing humility like armor. And that's how, on a routine flight from Dallas to San Francisco, arrogance met its altitude. If this happened to you, if you were in Jamal's shoes, would you stay silent, or would you make the world watch? If this story moved you, don't let it fade into the scroll. Like this video to stand for respect. Share it to start a conversation. And subscribe to join our movement, ensuring that no voice is ever silenced again. Join the conversation, and let the world know that you're watching,